Cool, thank you. Thanks everyone for having me as your guest. My full name is Yessica Avila Barojas. And before starting the presentation, I also wanted to talk a little bit about my positionality in this topic. I am undocumented, specifically documented, meaning I have a work permit, and to an extent, I am protected from deportation. I'm also queer. I am not a parent, but I am in a relationship with someone who is queer. We actually recently got married, and my wife and I'm so excited to call her my wife. My wife and we have a lot of conversations about what kind of family we want to create, especially because we see how we were raised in very specific families. We both come from immigrant parents. I come from an undocumented unit, and those are just conversations we constantly have. And I know this class is very interactive, so please feel free to send comments on the chat or just engage with the topic as I am going through the slides. I'm happy to engage in conversation. And then I'll start sharing my screen now. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes. You might want to do like presentation mode unless you definitely want to see your notes on the side. And there you go.
I'm trying to find a presentation mode.
If you just say share, no, not share.
It's on the bottom right where that's the plus and minus. You see that little screen? Yeah, right there.
That makes sense. Thank you. So let me see. Let me go to the next slide. So just a quick overview about the topics that we're going to talk about today is the undocumented queer parenting, navigating external and internal threats to family by Katie Jocelyn Maldonado Dominguez, and Our Modern Family with Louis, Dr. Anita, and Ray. And the last video is Conversamos, Growing Up and Raising Queer Latinx with Dr. Anita and Sergio Gonzalez. So to start off this conversation, I wanted to highlight this quote, and that's because I felt like this is gonna basically create the base to the whole conversation. And this quote is specifically from the chapter that we read on undocumented parenting. And the quote reads, "Families are not uniform, but society assumes that they all fall under one hegemonic mold, that of self-sufficient, middle-class, heteronormative, nuclear household." So what I decided to do was show an image of what I think when I think of that idea of family. And I grew up with Seven Heaven. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with the show, but it's very white, middle class, and very heteronormative. I feel like a lot of the issues that they tackle oftentimes are very specific to white folks. So growing up, I didn't feel represented in this family. And I feel like I internalized a lot of that. I felt like there was something wrong with my family because we didn't fit this idea. And on the right side, you see a very different portrayal of what a family looks like. And I don't know if everyone's familiar with this show, it's Pose. And before I start, I guess I wanted to provide a little bit of context for the people that haven't watched the show before. Here you see a family of all queer people. Bianca on the right side, she's a trans mother. And then on the left side, you see Angel, and she's also a trans woman. And then in the center is Damien, who is a young gay man. And basically, this is a TV show that takes place in the early 1980s, early 1990s, and is based in New York, and it has to do with the ballroom scene. And for those of you that don't know what the ballroom scene, that was a space created underground by brown and black LGBTQ plus people as a way to create their own community where they got to perform and really got to express their full self, something that they couldn't do in society because of homophobia and transphobia. And then on this slide, I wanted to show a very small clip of that show. You'll specifically see Electra, who is the person right the cover of this video, and you see her interaction with Bianca. And we get to kind of start seeing the dynamics that come to play when it comes to their relationship. So I'll play it and then we can talk more about it.
You think I just woke up one day and poof, I look like this? No, it takes work, drive, sacrifice to be a woman. You have something rarer than beauty, though. You have heart, and you're not afraid to lead with it. That quality will get you everything. You're coming home with mother. Check, please.
Wait, you want to be my mother?
No. I am your mother.
Selector, you have a visitor. Is now a good time?
So in this scene, we see how Electra is talking to Bianca and inviting her to be part of her family or her house. And we start seeing how Electra kind of starts telling her how hard it is to be a woman. And also, I think we also see some of the like glimpses of what we get to know Electra to be later on, which is someone who's very fierce, very independent. And to some people, she can be seen as very self-centered. And we see how her character is also a little bit of villainized when it comes to how she's portrayed as a mother, because she's portrayed as someone who's not perfect, who has flaws. And then on the other hand, we see how Bianca, she's told that she has this very special thing, which is love. But when we think about love, a lot of times we associate love with being sacrificed, like we self-sacrificing. And throughout the story, we also see how Bianca does a lot for her kids and even like doesn't tell them things about, like, I don't want to spoil things for people that haven't watched Pose, but she doesn't want to disclose personal information about herself in order to protect her children. And she's just willing to sacrifice so much for them. And also she becomes to an extent very codependent. We see that in that relationship. And as the show progresses, you kind of see how Electra falls more into a category of what I think a real mother would be, which is not to say that Bianca is not a mother, but Bianca falls more onto like an idea of what we want mothers to be. So Electra is someone who has flaws, who will make mistakes, who is herself as a person, aside from just being a mother. And Bianca just kind of becomes this like idea of what we all think that a mother should be, which is someone that sacrifices, who puts her family first and herself last. And I wanted to pose this question to the group to see if anyone had any thoughts on how you all think that queer folks replicate some of that like heteronormative expectation of what mothers should be, or also what like heteronormative families should look like. Oops, sorry, I went.
So Yessica, say the question again so that folks can chime in. I know folks are in the chat, so please feel free to share.
So the question is like, where we see how Electra and Bianca, they're both trans women, but they still like in this narrative, you still kind of see what they're both being held to when it comes to what kind of good mother you should be, which is that of a heteronormative expectation of self-sacrificing and putting yourself last. And my question is like, how do you think other queer folks also uphold some of these values when it comes to forming families, or when it comes to playing like, not playing a role, but like becoming a parent?
Hi, I'm Jesse. And pronouns he, they. And I'm a big fan of the show, so I've seen like both seasons. Hell, the show's amazing. So I guess like the approaches they take to like being parents, or the way they kind of like emulates like what a nuclear family is, that I've seen is like they both like embrace, or like they take the form or the role of being like the matriarch of the family, and then like they teach how their children how to love one another. So like they completely upend like like dismantle and then recreate what a nuclear family is, because like they only have themselves, and then like their other like LGBTQIA plus like sisters and even brothers. And so they teach their kids like surviving skills, like obviously how to love one another, how to create community, and like just to like go for their dreams and stuff like that. So
Yeah, I agree. I feel like they definitely create their own type of family within what was given to them, the resources that they have. Um, Something that I know that I personally experienced, like as a queer person, is a lot of times there's still certain standards that we have when it comes to being queer, or that we somehow internalize at the same time. Like I know one of the common ones is, for example, same-sex marriage. Like I benefit from that. Like I mentioned, like I recently got married, and as someone who's undocumented, this means so much more than it just signing papers. Unfortunately, like I hate to think about it, but it does carry that type of power. But I also am aware that that's not, it doesn't solve any, like it doesn't solve all the issues that the LGBTQ plus community faces. And I feel like sometimes some folks just kind of like get stuck there and that's it. Like we just buy into wanting to have what the straight people have. And marriage is one of those things. And we don't go further into like what other things are like systemically oppressing our communities.
Yeah, I really appreciate the differences and the points that you're bringing up, Yessica, because I think what Pose does is that it tries to complicate the like the chase for heteronormativity, right? Like so there's like some aspects of like we want a family, we want, you know, to be that perfect mom, like, you know, like Blanca wanting to be that perfect mom, wanting to be self-sacrificing, but also not fitting the norm, not fitting the expectations. And, you know, like I told you, I really appreciate Electra because as mean as she is, like she's still able to like maintain a relationship with Blanca and eventually her other daughters. Um, and then also they're just, you know, there's the messiness of it. And I think one of the things, especially for Chicanx, Latinx folks and other, you know, folks of color, is that because we've experienced so much marginalization and so much hatred from external, you know, forces, both structural and like white folks, um, we usually tend to idealize our own families, right? So much so that we don't really name the problems of of our families. We don't name the pain and the woundings that happen within our own families because we don't want them to be pathologized, right? And so Pose, I think, allows us to see like the layering of like pain and hurt without going to pathology, without going to like the negative stereotypes that people want to place on our communities and our families. So it's really powerful to be able to see like complicated characters, complex stories told by people who are living those lives themselves. So it's so transformative and revolutionary to just have those stories being told and shared with us.
I agree. Would anyone else like to add to the conversation? I'll go to the next slide. So before I start talking about this slide, I do want to disclose that although a lot of these experiences are layered, like Profe Anita was mentioning, in this specific context, we're still kind of like approaching it in a more general term. People within the queer community or LGBTQ plus specifically, we are all different. We are not just one way of being, and we all face different obstacles and barriers. And the same thing is said about undocumented people. And in this case, I'm not addressing how this experiences intersect with other identities such as gender, race, or disability. So what you see here is on the left side, you see queer parents. And what I wanted to highlight is how queer parents have face obstacles when they're trying to create this idea of family. A lot of times queer parents experience discrimination when it comes to adoption. They also experience barriers when it comes to having children, biological children, and depending on like within the queer community where you fall or what type of experiences you have, you also have the barrier of the financial part. Discrimination in employment is still very common. And on the other side, you have undocumented parents on the right side, and undocumented parents struggle to create this idea of family because of deportation. Not just a stress, but it is a reality for a lot of people. Family separation does happen. And when one parent is removed from the family, it leaves the other parent to take on all the responsibility. In some cases, both parents are like removed from the family and the children have to go to a different family member or someone else who can take care of them. They also face a lot of discrimination because of their immigration status. And when they are able to work, they have to work for many hours and have very low wages. They also lack access to resources. I think the most common one right now that I think we all can talk about is COVID-19. The stimulus check, for example, is something that undocumented people cannot access. A lot of resources that are going out, I know because I try to apply to some grants. A lot of times require a social security number, emails, and these things are very like come to us as a very like kind of common sense sometimes. But when you think about someone who's undocumented, when they provide that type of information, they're putting themselves in a very vulnerable position. And the fear of being deported is a very real thing. And it's not just a fear, like I mentioned, like it does happen. And then I decided to put queer and undocumented parents right in the middle. And that's because everything that I just mentioned, queer and undocumented parents experience that. As a queer undocumented person, you will experience discrimination due to your immigration status, and you will also experience discrimination due to your sexuality. We know that there's already not a lot of resources to the LGBTQ community, but when you're undocumented, like that adds a barrier where you can't even access those resources that are there. And also face the fear of deportation and the possibility of deportation. And what was that? And when they try to have like create their own family, the same thing is said, like like I mentioned, like discrimination when it comes to adoption. Like I was reviewing my notes and I feel like some of this stuff still doesn't always like sit in my mind. Like I know I'm undocumented, but I don't like to think about it like all the time because it's very stressful. And I realized that in order for me to adopt someone, it doesn't matter how fit I am as a parent because I don't have a social security number. Right now I have one that's with the work permit, but even that doesn't allow me to adopt a child. And financially, I'm not able to biologically have my own children. So there's already a lot of barriers there that I'm seeing, and I didn't even realize because like I said, like I don't think so much about it until I was reviewing my notes. And I guess to talk more about like myself too, it's like when I was younger, I was around 16, I would say, when I realized that I was queer. And I didn't know who to talk to because it was hard to be like, I'm queer and I'm undocumented because there was a lot of the fear of like, what's gonna happen to me and my family. And I was trying to look for resources, but in school, they didn't really have a lot of things for LGBTQ plus. We didn't have our first like gay straight alliance group till like I was my senior year. And even that, like the part about being undocumented never even came into it. And I remember researching for some resources because I was like, you know, I think I'm queer. I want to tell my parents. And when I looked for those resources, everything I found was like social security number needed. I didn't have one. And I was like, how am I supposed to access any of these resources if I tell my parents? I was raised in a very Catholic household. They're not going to be happy. They're going to kick me out. So it's not safe for me to come out. And I decided not to do that when I was 16. And instead I repressed a lot of those feelings and internalized a lot more homophobia. But yeah, that's what I wanted to share for this slide. And I wanted to see if anyone else has any questions or wants to add to the conversation. Go to the next slide. So here I wanted to talk about gender performance and gender familial acceptance. And I chose this quote. By gender performance, I'm referring to the act of performing a pre-existing gender role, which depending on the performance may embody or challenge mainstream notions of gender. And throughout this chapter, we see how Ana and Sergio's experience is very different when it comes to the homophobia that they face. And I wanted to ask the class, why do you think that that happens?
You might have to ask the question again. It's more direct.
So why do you think that Ana and Sergio experience homophobia differently?
So what I think we could do too, just because I know that probably not everybody got to read the article, is talk a little bit about it, right? So, Yessica, do you want to like give a little bit of context, and then folks who did get a chance to read it, maybe you can sound off on it and then answer the question.
Sure. So basically in this chapter, we get to see the story of Ana, who identifies as a lesbian, and what her life looks like coming to this country in order to come and support her sister and her brother-in-law, who is Sergio. And as the chapter progresses, we find out that Sergio is also queer. He identifies as a gay man, and he comes out to his wife. When he comes out to his wife, this kind of just changes all the dynamics in the family. Ana was there as a middle woman, and what that means is she was there to be a caregiver to the children that they had, and also to support the family and be part of the family financially and emotionally. And when Sergio comes out to his wife, they end up getting a divorce, and the wife is, I'm sure that she had her process, but is still okay with maintaining a relationship with Sergio. And but soon after, she marries another man who's very homophobic, who asks her to pick between him and his sister, basically. I mean, her sister, Ana, and the sister decides to pick her husband and kicks Ana out. And something I completely didn't add is that they're all undocumented. So she kicks out Ana out of the family unit, and then Ana has to find a way to still find a place to sleep. Luckily, she is in a relationship at the time, so she's able to move in with her partner. And then we get to hear more about Ana's experience being rejected from her family and having to live away from the children because of the homophobia that she experienced by her new brother-in-law. And we kind of basically see how homophobia plays out differently when it comes to Ana and Sergio, because Sergio is a gay man, but he's still allowed to be around his kids, and he still maintains a relationship with his ex-wife. And throughout the chapter, he doesn't mention anything about having a negative experience with the homophobic husband that Cecilia, the sister or the wife, is married to. And what the author in this chapter points out is that when we think about masculinity, we think about how masculinity is basically defined by three things, and that is a man's a man being able to provide financially, sexual powerness, and also physical strength. And by these three categories, Sergio falls under the being able to provide financially. So he still carries that masculinity, and because he performs that, he is protected by patriarchy, and he doesn't have to experience homophobia the same way that Ana does. Ana, on the other hand, is not. She's a woman, and she is not protected by anything other than by Sergio. And when he basically removes himself after the divorce, Ana loses protection from Sergio. And when that happens, she basically loses her whole family and experiences emotional violence by her sister's new husband. And I would say also by the sister, by kicking her out, like it's very hard to be like kicked out like that, especially when you're undocumented. Like I mentioned, there's not a lot of resources. We do see them now, but even today, like there's not that many organizations that are working with undocumented LGBTQ plus people. There are, but not in ways that I think there should be. And I think that's something that the author of this chapter also highlights. Um, and then with Cecilia, who is a sister, we kind of see her kind of play this more neutral role, but at the same time, like something that crossed my mind that I talked to Profe Anita about is how she went from basically having a queer husband to having an extreme homophobic husband. And it does make me think, like, was she trying to compensate for something? Because I feel like that's just so polar opposite. Um, and I know for myself, like my sister is cis hetero, very very hetero. I feel like I need to highlight that, but she has worked on herself and continues to work on herself on how to be a better ally and accomplice to me as a queer person. And I remember one time she told me that she was on this date with someone and they were having dinner at his house. His parents were very Christian and started talking about queer folks and saying how bad it was and how queer people were living in sin and all of that. And she interrupted that conversation because she did not want for that violence to continue. And that right there was homophobia. And I remember when she told me, I felt very like proud of her, I would say, because she stepped in and and I wasn't even there. And I feel like that's something that needs to happen where like that violence was still happening and she didn't need me to tell her, hey, this is happening, stop it, you know? And I wanted to see also from the class, like, have you ever experienced something like this where you had to step up and say something about like people being homophobic or transphobic?
Thank you, Yessica. Do any of you have reflections about this? Again, back, I think Yessica kind of answered the question, but I think you can also add any nuances that you picked up, right? Like, why is Sergio protected, right? Why does Sergio have such a different experience from Ana? And as a gay man, and both are Hondureños, both are undocumented, and both are queer. Why is their experience so different?
I'm going to admit and say that I didn't do the reading, but also just to add on to that is I think that overall, like as Yessica mentioned, that men are protected by patriarchy. They're given more slack to work with, and I think that women oftentimes get targeted because they're looked at as an easier target than men are, and I definitely think that it's unjust for two people to go through the same experiences, but one to be, in a sense, antagonized severely. It's a very difficult thing to process, and something that I think is interesting. This is actually talking about this is actually interesting to me to actually like research and to see why,
Yeah.
But I all signs for me point to like the patriarchal society that we have today that protects men and attacks women.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. And absolutely, if you did not get a chance to read it, thank you for being honest. And maybe this discussion will help you want to read it. And just so you know, it's a brand new book that that Yessica picked this from. It's called "We Are Not Your Dreamers: Undocumented Scholars Theorize Undocumented Life in the U.S." Literally just came out in August 2020, and the editors are Leisy, Abrego, and Genevieve Gonzales. And so Negron-Gonzales. And so, it's a wonderful new book that our colegas put out and highlighted the voices of undocumented scholars and students and activists, right? So I really want to encourage all of you to look at it. And then I also love the fact that there are queer undocumented voices, which we want obviously more of. So even if you haven't read it, I want to encourage you to join the conversation. And then back to Jessica's question, like, have you ever been in that space where you've had to interrupt, homophobia, transphobia, either as an ally, a co-conspirator, or again, if you yourself are a queer, trans, or non-binary person, how do you interrupt it? What are your experiences with that?
I'll share again. uh, there's, even in my family, I feel that there are traces of homophobia, even though like a lot of people nowadays like to say they're open-minded. I do think that even if you're open-minded, there can still be that underlying tendency to go there. And in my family, there have been times where they're talking about like family friends who happen to be fall under the LGBTQIA spectrum, and they were mentioned like, oh, I just think there's something that's not right, like with their mind. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, people can love who they want to. People are allowed to be who they are. Nobody's telling you how to behave, how to act, who to love, right? So I just don't think you should be imposing the same views on others. I definitely think that it's just a fear of the unknown, right? The lack of understanding, and don't know how to process it. So instead of trying to come to terms with it, they oftentimes label it as like other, right? Just so that they don't think about it.
Yeah, and again, I think why this is so important is because undocumented communities are so, disenfranchised and marginalized, right? And so are queer and trans communities. And so it's really sad when we cannot have support of each other, right? And when especially undocumented cis hetero people can't understand that they're harming people within their own community, right? And people who are having layer upon layer of harm and wounding even within their own family. So this chapter, it's heartbreaking, right? Ana is the sister of this woman who needed help to take care of her children. She gave up her time. She worked at night to take care of, I think, 5 or 6 children. And, she had a husband who was closeted and then came out. And then he was protected because he was still a man, he was still the father, and he made money. And yet, even though he was protected, she was kicked out of the home and replaced with an even more homophobic, well, not even more homophobic, with an extra homophobic patriarch in the home. So the power of patriarchy in this one family it's devastating. Jessica, do you want to say more? There's a couple of comments in the chat. Pedro says in queer male circles, he's had to confront transphobia a couple of times. And again, just because you're queer doesn't mean that you're not transphobic. In fact, it's rampant in queer spaces. He says, the self-education is also necessary, right? Learning to educate ourselves so that we can have that education or, advocacy with other people. As I mentioned in other classes, like if we can't even articulate the argument, you're not going to be able to have that argument with other folks in other spaces, especially your family, because families are the hardest. Sometimes it's easier to have the argument outside of our homes, instead of with people right inside your own house or your own family. Jessica?
Yeah, I wanted to add, I know we talked about this, but Sergio also, he yields power over his ex-wife, Cecilia. Even though he's a gay man, he's still a cis man. And I feel like when I was reading this chapter, it felt like Cecilia had extra empathy for him. And I feel like a lot of that has to do with how much we are conditioned to basically like make room for men to make mistakes. And when it comes to the comment about like family and having those difficult conversations, I know I can relate. Um, I didn't just come out like, and everyone was happy about it. My mom was very welcoming, which was very surprising. And I don't think that had to do, I think that had to do a lot with her growing older and exposing herself to a lot more things. Her best friend is actually queer, but the rest of my family, that's not the case. And I don't bother with some of them because when it comes specific to like my identity, um, because it is very painful and they will say very hurtful things.
Thank you, Yessica. I know there's more comments, but we only have about 15 minutes, and I know you have several other slides. Why don't we go ahead and continue with the slides, and then we can go back to some discussion.
Okay. So I'll move on into the interview, where it's our modern family interview, and I drew out some points that I felt were very important to talk about, and one of them was family responsibility. I feel like this might be a very common thing that we all experience when it comes to the responsibility we feel to our family, either emotionally, financially, or both. I know for myself as the oldest daughter, I've always felt this way. And when I was reading the book, I also was thinking about how this is imposed on queer people because we don't live this very like this expectation of like heteronormativeness. Like I mentioned, my partner and I, like, we're queer. I don't know if we're gonna have kids. We have a puppy right now, and we don't really think about like children anytime soon. So if my sister has children, that's gonna change everything because she's gonna become more of this idea of what a family looks like, and that responsibility I already have as the oldest daughter is probably gonna double up because I don't have that um, I don't have like that family of like a husband and then children and those responsibilities that fall under. And we see it in the chapter that we were talking about before with Anna, where she had to pay for her dad's funeral, even though her dad kicked her out and like was very like emotionally violent to her. And she basically wasn't able to walk away from it because her sister wasn't expected to do the same thing. Her sister had that idea of family. So Anna had to pay, even though she didn't have like a lot of money. And she was also struggling with a lot of things emotionally. And I also wanted to add, like, this is not limited to queer folks. This also extends to like people who are single and don't marry or don't fall under that category, like a single tia or tío. Um, and then that's why I also think it's really important that we begin to redefine how we describe families. It's not something new. We've already seen it. There's a lot of people who are raised in families that are single parents. I've also seen like for example, imposed as a chosen family, people who are choosing who they're in family with, people who have their community as a family, um, who don't fall under this idea of what that looks like. And I also feel like by creating this new definition of how we see families, we see them as a way that they are resistant towards like systemic oppression, and not so much as families that are deficient in something. And I think of it more through like my personal experience and growing up in an undocumented family. Like my mom wasn't around a lot. And I know that's not limited to undocumented people. I know a lot of people who are immigrants, first, second, third, more, also experience something like this where parents work a lot of hours and they're rarely home. I know my mom couldn't make it to a lot of my school like activities. And growing up, like I was watching Seven Heaven and I'm like, why is my mom not coming baking cookies like that white lady on TV? Now that I'm older, I realize, well, she's having to face all these different things. She's having to work long hours. It wasn't that she didn't want to be there, it's that she couldn't be there. She wasn't allowed. Now her and I have very sincere conversations And I know that she was basically working at a sweatshop, and they were not letting her have breaks. They were not letting her call in sick or go to the doctor to take me or my sister. Um, and I felt like I was missing out. But then now that I'm old, now that I'm older, I realized that when my mom wasn't able to step in, I had my aunt step in. And a lot of times, a lot of people thought one of my aunts was my mom, and then they saw a different aunt and they thought that was my other mom. Um, and now that I'm older, I like claim all of them as my moms, and I feel very privileged to have had them. And I also think about how their way of raising me was a queer way, and also they provided me with abundance of love, and that's how I like to reframe it now. And I do have a discussion question for this one. I wanted to ask, like, how do you see yourself creating your family? And I created an account of Padlet, so I can share that link with everyone, and you can just drop in your comments there.
Nice, thank you. While you're sharing that in the chat, I just wanted to say kind of how that video came to be. I shared it in the chat as well for folks who didn't get to see it. It's a short clip. There are folks that are part of an organization, or I think it was paid for by Advocates for Youth. It's a national organization, and they hired a, a friend of mine, a former student, was also working with a wonderful queer I guess, activist who interviewed me, Louis, who was who was the interviewer in the video. And one of the things that I loved is that Louis also is a father to I think his nephew, and so he's redefining right fatherhood, and he talks a lot about what that looks like in his family, and how different it is, right, to be a queer person who's not living a traditional parenting experience, and who maybe didn't plan it like other people plan parenting. And so if you watch the little clip, I'm happy to, talk more about it, but the clip is just me and my niece being interviewed about how we came to be, I came to be her parent, and what she feels like as a young queer child, what I'm like as a queer parent. And then the other video that we watched afterwards, or as well, is the most recent interview where myself and my queer tea, Sergio Gonzalez, who's a Joteria scholar, he also talks about being a queer child, and I talk about both being a queer child and a queer parent, and what my mother was like in terms of creating space for me as a young person, because I grew up hetero. I didn't come out to myself even. I didn't even realize I was queer until my mid-20s. And so, again, it's very diverse for many of us. Not everybody kind of is in touch with that queer identity at a young age. And so I like to share my experience because it's so different than many other people's experiences. And it really does show a lot about a lot of my own fluidity and the capacity to be sexually fluid, and come out at a later time in life. And then also for families, Latinx families, in my case, Tejana Chicana family, to be open and inclusive. My mom was always very, very open and inclusive. And my mom even identifies as either bi or queer herself. She's really a radical feminist in her own right. So anybody want to share what you are writing in the Padlet? Or Yessica, do you want to give us more info about the Padlet?
Yeah, I am reading the comments right now, and I was also going to ask if anyone would like to share, or if it's okay if how much time do we have? I also want to be respectful of time.
We end at 2:55.
Okay, because I have one more slide. I was gonna read the comments. If everyone has access to it, there's already a few comments there. I could read, but it might take a minute.
We could read a couple maybe, and then folks can feel free to keep adding and or add even after class.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see, I'll start with my ideal family. The family I seek to build is one that is empathetic and compassionate enough to find some time every day to talk about our feelings and how our day was. One where we can freely express our identities with each other without shame or fear of what we might think. All my life, I wanted to have a safe space where I would not be afraid of losing people for being myself. And I hope to the universe that my future family can give that safety to my children. And I think, and grandchildren. Thank you for sharing. Another comment is a family, they're moving around. A family that is actively dismantles patriarchy, homophobia, and transphobia. Yeah, I agree with both comments. Let me see. A family that recognizes we're all human, who embodies flaws to create a safe space for my partner and children. And we are, or I think they're still typing. Ideal family should be one of acceptance and one where everyone seeks self nurture and growth rather than, I think they might still be typing. So I feel like I always feel, I feel like shame is not good, but sometimes I feel a little bit shy about like disclosing that I watched the L Word when I was exploring my sexuality. Because I know that's not like a correct portrayal and it carries a lot of problematic things. But I know they did a new remake and my partner and I saw an episode where they have a queer couple and one of them has a family really be involved in like the whole planning of the, like, I think they were getting married and they are super involved in all of this. And my partner and I, like, I feel like I think I teared up because I really wanted that for myself. And I didn't think I could have that. And like shortly after, like my mom is now like very happy to come and see me and my partner. And I feel very privileged to have that. Like I'm very aware of that. But I think it's also like really sad that we don't have those things and that I didn't realize how much I wanted that until I saw it represented on TV in a show that I'm not even gonna like, you know, that it's not a perfect portrayal of like the LGBTQ plus community.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. You want to share the last slide or the last two slides?
Yeah, let's see. So conversamos, growing up and raising queer Latina and Latinx. This was another interview where Dr. Anita also participated and Sergio. And I know they shared their story about coming out. So I wanted to also share mine. And that's because mine, like we all have different stories. I wanted to highlight that too. Mine was like one that intersected with like being undocumented. And I always think about how I had to come out twice. I grew up with a lot of fear of telling people I was undocumented. If like my younger self would see me, like right now having a presentation telling people that I'm undocumented, she'd be like, what? Because there's just so much stigma around it and there continues to be. But I remember having a lot of fear and insecurity and feeling like people were gonna reject me if I told them that I was undocumented. Not even my closest friends knew. And then when it came to being queer, I was like, how do I tell them? Like, I went through one hurdle, which was I came out as undocumented first, and then that was so stressful. And then I'm like, now I have to tell them I'm queer. And it's not so much that I had to, but you know, I wanted to. But it was just so difficult. And when I reflect back on it, a lot of the same stress that I was facing with like telling people I was queer, I was feeling when I was telling people I was undocumented. So I wanted to share that and how difficult that was. And also how I think it's something important to keep in mind when it comes to like the undocumented movement. It's not one way of being. There are a lot of different people. There are people who are queer and as I'm sure some of you have seen, like people are seeking refugee because there's a lot of homophobia in their home countries and a lot of violence. Um, and that's something that like a lot of times doesn't get talked about because we have this main narrative of what an undocumented person is. Um, and then the other stuff that I think Dr. Anita was already talking a little bit about is like homophobia and patriarchy, and like how that leads to sexual repression, and it basically it doesn't allow people to explore their sexuality. I know for me, like I didn't get to explore my sexuality until like my 20s, and after having a conversation with my therapist, I found out that that affected my development. And when she mentioned that, I was like, well, that makes a lot of sense now. Because when I remember when I was first like coming out, I was like, I want to meet people and like, I just want to date people. I don't want to be in a relationship with people. But I was surrounded by a lot of queer folks, some of them who identify as lesbians, who put a lot of pressure on me to like basically like jump into a relationship with people and U-Haul it. And I felt so bad because I thought that I was doing the queer thing wrong. I was like, maybe I'm not queer, maybe I'm something else. Because I wasn't like meeting that standard that they had created. And I think it has to do more with that standard than it has to do with my development. But it did make me reflect on how like as a 20-year-old I was experiencing or like basically like exploring things that a teenager would, which is like, you know, in your teenage years, you start dating people. You don't really think about getting married. And that was me in my early 20s, in my mid 20s. And now I'm happily married, but that was after I felt very comfortable in my sexuality. And then I also created a different board for this one. And I wanted to know if you all feel like you have the freedom to explore your sexuality. So I'll share the link in just a sec.
And I know that we're pretty much out of the class time, but if folks want to stay on, you can stay on the next few minutes and fill out the Padlet. And if not, you know, it was great to have you and thank you so much.
Yeah, I just realized it was 2:56.
We can continue. We'll take a couple of minutes to add some stuff. So what is the question for the Padlet?
So do you all feel like you have the freedom to explore your sexuality without feeling the pressure that you will be stigmatized or forced to fit a certain category?
Thank you for this, Yessica. I love the questions and I love the readings and the discussion. Does anybody have any comments or questions before you get going? How about we stop the share so that way we can see folks? Thank you, everybody. Any last comments, Yessica?
I just want to thank everyone for inviting me to the class and also for participating in the conversation. Hope you all enjoyed it.
I definitely did. Anybody want to take a quick picture with us? Turn your screens on if you're willing. And I'm going to take a picture with Yessica, even if it's just us. All right, 1, 2, 3. Ay, Marcela, qué bonita. 1, 2, 3. One more, just in case I close my eyes. 1, 2, 3. Thank you all. I love y'all. I hope y'all have a wonderful non-colonizing holiday. Go be decolonial, even if you eat turkey. Enjoy your families, enjoy your people. Reach out if y'all are having tough times. I've uploaded all of the stuff that you need.